We're glad you're here tonight. We'd remind you of the question period that should follow, theoretically in about an hour. We have difficulty with that this evening because we're putting two sessions together and we're going to be fairly successful at cutting each in half. But I may give you a little bit of warning. We're talking about the fossil record, which I think is critical evidence. If I'm debating this on the college campus, this is the subject I want to talk about, because this is where it's at as far as historical hard evidence for what happened in the past. Notice the statement by S.M. Stanley of Johns Hopkins University, who understands the implications. He says, "It's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis." I think he's right. And I think they are without the fossils. I think they're very much in favor of creation. I think they're positive evidence for a catastrophic flood. But he says the fossil record, and only the fossil record, provide direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. This is it. If they don't have this, then it's an outrageous hypothesis. Okay, how do you look at the fossil record and distinguish between creation and evolution? What would you expect to see if this is true, or what would you expect to see if the alternative is? There are contrasting predictions, and this is one of the ways that we test models, as we have indicated. And especially when you look at the beginning of the fossil record, there would be very different predictions. The creationist would say sudden, complex. The evolutionist says simple, gradual. It's linked as you go upward. There's an allied continuum, a progression upward to more complex, whereas the creationist says, no, it's complex and abrupt right from the start. And as you go up, then it's distinct and separate. Stasis, that is the opposite of evolution. Stasis, we get status quo from it, fancy word that means not change, is the description that we would predict. So we should be able to look at the record and see which model is served best by the facts. Often we hear about similarities, and most of the time they say, well, this means evolution, but creationists would predict similarities as well due to the fact that we have a common creator and he would create similar forms for similar functions, but there would be differences in the similarities. The evolutionist would predict a branching pattern like nested tables that would gradually develop, whereas the similarities the creationist would predict would be like the designing artist would use a blue tile here and a blue tile there, making a mosaic, not the connected branching pattern, but separate and distinct similarities, but a difference that we would be able to distinguish. Now, how do you know what the nature of the fossil record is? I could say, well, it was sudden and complex from the beginning, distinct and separate as you go forward, and the similarities are mosaic similarities. And a lot of people think, well, you're prejudiced about that. We're going to allow the evolutionist to describe the nature of the evidence using quotes from antagonistic witnesses. Now, that's sometimes misunderstood. Well, you're not being fair. You're quoting from people that don't agree. Well, that's the point. And that makes the evidence more valuable. If you have testimony in court from a friendly witness, that will help. If you say the accused is honest, there's no reasonable, but he's a friend. You expect him to say that. If, on the other hand, the antagonistic witness acknowledges the same points, it's worth much more. Legally, they're described as the difference between the friendly testimony and acknowledgments contrary to interest. And so we're going to be using those who are acknowledging points contrary to their own interest, that would acknowledge what we think ought to be predicted. So I want you to understand that all of the quotes are from antagonistic witnesses. They are from devout believers, but believers in evolution. These are truly men of great faith, but faith in evolution. Now, let's begin with Richard Dawkins. Certainly would qualify as an antagonistic witness, and he's describing the beginning, the critical part of the fossil record. Down at the bottom, as they define the bottom in the geologic column, he says, we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. Isn't that an interesting statement? How do you know it's evolution if, boom, there they are? Certainly no record of it. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Now, he believes in the evolutionary history, but it's not there. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationist. And I'll plead guilty. Yes, that's what we predict. Another way of saying that. That's the way you test the model, and he's confirming it. When we look at National Geographic's description of the beginning of the fossil record, talking about that lowest layer, the Cambrian layer, well, just looking at this chart, the explosion of life. This is from one of the issues of National Geographic. Stephen Gould, a very famous evolutionist from Harvard, describes it this way: the Cambrian explosion, as National Geographic had indicated, occurred in a geological moment, and we have reason to think all major anatomical designs, now we called him slipping there, he didn't believe they were designed, but that's the way they look, may have made their evolutionary appearance. Now, it was evolutionary, but boom, there it is. And all of the major anatomical designs are right there in an explosion in the beginning, but that's evolution. Wait a minute, no, that's not evolution. It's an explosion. Not only the phylum Chordata, and that's the major biological group that would include us, animals with backbones, not only the phylum Chordata, but all of its major divisions. So here is that highest order, all of the divisions of that highest order, right at the bottom, at the beginning, as they define it. Contrary, he says, to Darwin's expectations. Another way to say that is this is not what they predict. This is what we predict, contrary to their predictions. And then, even worse, since the so-called Cambrian explosion, no new phyla of animals have entered the fossil record. You got all of them right at the bottom, at the start, and since then you got no new ones. Now, does that sound like evolution to you? If I had written the story, I don't think I could have done it myself, but this is the antagonistic witness who is acknowledging this. Notice the description by Michael Maltz, University of Texas at Austin. The Cambrian explosion, it wasn't, as predicted, it wasn't a gradual development of complexity. These things suddenly seem to burst out of a magic box. Well, yeah, that's a pretty good description. And as we go, some would say, well, that was a while back, but then we've seen that since Darwin's day, all the way up to 2012 now from evolutionary biology. One of the leading authorities is saying fossils from the Cambrian period can cause a real headache for evolutionary biologists. Again, another way of saying it does not fit our predictions. They expect, or we expect, he says, simple organisms evolving over time to become increasingly more complex. That's the prediction of the evolution model. However, during the Cambrian period, there was an apparent explosion of different major groups of animals, all appearing simultaneously in the fossil record. Now, again, if I were making this up, I don't think I could have done it better, but this is not a creationist, this is the evolutionist. And if you want to just bring it right up to the most current time, this is less than 6 months ago in Science, the coming out party for animal life on Earth during the Cambrian. Nearly all the modern animal groups, as diverse as mollusks and chordates, the animals with backbones, leapt into the fossil record. Those early marine animals exhibited a dazzling array of body parts. Now, right at the bottom, you've got what lived at the bottom of the ocean, as we pointed out last evening, but they're very complex, and they're from all of the major groups, just as those predicting a flood deposit would expect. But a sudden complex beginning. Now, how do you account for that? This is a challenge they've wrestled with, but last year they came up with a new wrinkle. Well, I guess you could describe it. It shows how hard they're pressed to try to explain this Cambrian explosion. It certainly doesn't look like evolution, so what do you say about that? Well, a team of 33 authors, very respected scientists, published March 13, 2018 in the journal Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology, had a simple, if unusual, thesis regarding this Cambrian explosion. How, all of it, boom, right there to start with. How do you explain that? It was the direct result of an extraterrestrial virus that crashed to Earth in a meteor impact. Boom, came from outer space. Aliens are coming. And as a part of that thesis, octopuses, it's the same article, have complex nervous systems, camera-like eyes, capacity for camouflage without precedent in their family tree. Just boom, here's really weird alien-type critters. They posit that fertilized octopus eggs crashed into the sea aboard an icy comet at the onset of the Cambrian explosion. So how do you get this? Well, it all came from outer space. The aliens came. Alien octopuses. Well, I think that's entertaining. Why don't they do better than that? Well, because that's the best they can do. Summarizing, the evolutionists described the beginning as bursting out of a magic box, complex, suddenly, right at the start, again, not my words, but theirs, a real headache for evolutionary biologists, advanced, just planted without any evolutionary history. Nearly all the modern animal groups leapt into the fossil record. All the major anatomical designs, the chordata, all of its major divisions. And since then, since the Cambrian explosion, no new phyla. Now, the only solution is the aliens are coming. Again, this is the evolutionists saying that, the antagonistic witness, which gives even greater weight in terms of evidence. But in spite of these acknowledgments and these almost comical efforts to try to explain it, you still see this picture in the biology textbooks. Here's the simple animal down at the bottom, and all of it gradually came up from that. That's not what the fossil record says. Even as Gould acknowledges, the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however, not the evidence of the fossils. If you see that tree in your biology textbooks, just understand, even the leading authorities acknowledge that's not what the fossils say. Pretty well upside down. In fact, Gould points out in his book, Wonderful Life, that there is a cone of diversity that is predicted, beginning with very small, simple animals, gradually developing upward. But he says that's not the way it is. He says they have reversed, inverted the cone, and while we've got some left, we had more, and it's degenerated down to where we are now. I think you should have no trouble seeing which model is served best by the fossil record. But this is what we're dealing with in the biology textbooks. Well, how do they get this kind of arrangement? It seems like it's pretty precisely organized with the chordates at the top, which is what we find at the bottom, along with all the rest of it. How do you get it there? Well, back to Evolution of the Earth by Dot and Patton, standard geology textbook. We have arranged the groups in a traditional way. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? You were here last night. We arranged the rock layers. Well, we arrange the animals on the tree in a traditional way with the simplest forms first, progressively more complex groups following. This particular arrangement is arbitrary. Now, if I left that quote without more comment, I mean, that's what it says, but let's be as fair as we can. They go on the same page to point out, yes, there is more than just this arbitrary arrangement based on the assumption of evolution. There is a reasoned logic involved. Things are alike because they are related. Now, that's the assumption, of course, beginning with what would need to be proved, but that's the assumption of the evolutionist. The less they look alike, further removed they are from their common ancestor. But that's how they get their trees. Similarities line up and allow you to arrange the tree. So when we're talking then about their interpretation of the fossil record, we have to talk about similarities, because that's really the way they do it, not the fossils. And we certainly see similarities. We can look around the room and we notice some similarities to, should we say, apes? Don't want to get personal here, but yeah, there's similarities, dramatic similarities. It's obvious. The question is not whether there are similarities. The question is why there are similarities. The evolutionist doesn't ask that question. He knows what the answer is. The similarities always do. This has evolved thus far. But there are other explanations for similarities. We see houses that look alike in a subdivision because they're all cousins, right? Or maybe they had the same architect. That would explain rather than common genetics. That's an alternative. But when we're shown the similarities, for example, the pendactyl form of the vertebrate hand, varying from the frog and the rabbit, but they don't even think about it. This is because of evolution. They don't ask why, which is a good question. Why do you think there are similarities? Well, there are at least two possible answers: common genetics or common designer. Similar forms for similar functions would be expected. Until you look closely, especially in embryology, and you see the idea of common genetics doesn't work well at all. They don't come from similar parts of the embryo. The newt hand, for example, comes from segments 2 through 5. The lizard hand comes from segments 6 through 9. Now, if they were kin, they would come from the same part of the embryo with it. Common genetics are not involved here. The man's hand comes from segments 13 through 18. And so when you look at genetics, the homology, the similarity disappears completely. Sir Gavin de Beer, professor of embryology at Oxford, in the Oxford Reader, he's director of the British Museum of Natural History, said the attempt to find homologous genes has been given up as hopeless. Now, if it's due to common genetics, you ought to see similarity in the embryo, but that's not the case. Similarity is not genetic. It doesn't work as well. I not only think we can explain it well, I believe we can explain it better. As we're talking about similarities, we need to deal with some of the claims that are made. And how many of you have heard that chimpanzees and humans share 99% of our genes? Okay, we've all heard that. Richard Dawkins says that in The Blind Watchmaker. If they're still saying that, either they're very, very ignorant or they're intentionally deceiving. because that's way outdated. Looking at science, here 2007, the heading is Relative Differences, the myth of the 1% difference. Studies are showing humans and chimps are not as similar as many tend to believe. Chunks of missing DNA, extra genes, altered connections, the very structure of the chromosomes confound any quantification of humanness versus chimpness. It's so different, you can't quantify and say 1%, 10%, 6%, it's just different. And then more recently, in Nature, 2010, the comparison now reveals they differ radically in sequence structure, gene content. The chimpanzee genome is 10 to 15% longer, but see, there's just 1% difference, right? They know better than that. 50% of the human genes were missing from the chimp. How do you miss that point? Well, I don't think they do. But they continue to say there's just 1% difference. 1/3 more gene categories, entirely different classes of genes, but they're still saying there's just 1% difference. Don't believe everything you hear. Check up, see what the latest information says. And another point we need to make when we're dealing with similarities is the fact that a lot of things are similar that are not kin at all. We look at these two fish and they look similar. I see some heads nodding, and I caught you, because neither of them are fish. One is the reptile, the other is the mammal, the porpoise. Similar, but not related. So sometimes similarities indicate kinship, sometimes they don't. Guess which ones are picked? The ones that fit the paradigm. When you are able to select the similarities you want people to look at and ignore the other similarities and arrange the similarities the way you think it happened, then you can paint a lot of different pictures and certainly paint the one that you're looking for. We can illustrate this with our investigation into the genome and looking at the number of chromosomes lined up. We see penicillium, very simple organism, 2 chromosomes. Honeybee has 16, bat 44, humans 46. That looks like evolution, doesn't it? I mean, you can see this. You can count the chromosomes. So how do you deny that? That's an evolutionary progression. Well, you look at the rest of the information. This is a selected picture. The rest of the picture paints a very different picture. Fern has 380. Humans only got 46. The turkey's got a lot more than we do. The sweet potato has more than the turkey. When you get the rest of the picture that's left out, it looks different, doesn't it? You need the whole picture. Well, I'm looking at the facts, yes, but let's look at all of the facts. And the picture is different. When you look at similarities to various characteristics of men, you can say, all right, this indicates we're kin to the monkeys, for example. And yes, you can certainly see some similarities. With blood serum, there's very obvious similarities between human and chimpanzee. If the right anti-serum is used, you can actually use the blood serum from the chimpanzee. Very similar. But that's not the picture all the way through. For example, when you talk about milk chemistry, it's very, very different when you look at the ape milk chemistry. Where is the closest milk chemistry to the human in the animal world? Well, the donkey is actually pretty close. But even better than that and closer, you're not going to believe this. This is well documented. It's the cockroach. Here from Science News 2016, got milk. Roach milk could be a new superfood. Cockroach milk is among the most nutritious substances on earth, 3 times richer than in calories than buffalo milk, previous top contender, for the most protein, calorie-rich milk. a lot better and closer than the ape. In terms of cholesterol, which we're all interested in today, the closest relative is the garter snake. And some might say, well, yeah, I thought he might be kin there. But that's not the ape, not what is predicted by the evolutionist. Teeth are very resistant and are very important when we're considering the fossils of humans. We've got a lot of evidence there. What's the closest? The ape? Well, not really. It's the fish. What? You've seen fish teeth? That's a sheep head. Some of you might be envious. You look at the apes. No, that doesn't look that human, but you look at the sheep's head. That's some pretty good looking teeth there, aren't they? I think they were designed like ours were designed. You see the mosaic pattern, not that branching pattern of connections. In fact, you look at other fish, you see, for example, the parrotfish looks pretty similar, much more than the ape. When you look at foot structure, which we're concerned about, looking at the footprints down at Glen Rose, some suggest, well, maybe an ape did that, which of course doesn't help at all because apes and humans kind of supposed to evolve together and be in roughly the same time period. And when you look at the ape foot, it looks like a hand instead of a foot. But there are animals that have a foot almost identical to ours. The glacial bear, for example. Now, of course, he's a quadruped. He has claws, and the thumbs are on the outside. But when you look at the skeleton, removing the claws, that foot is just almost identical to the humans. Not the ape, but the bear. Tear enzyme that we see in humans is an amazing enzyme that is, designed to fight bacteria. We need that in our eyes, and they go around like little Pac-Man eating the bacteria. Well, the chicken needs that as it's laying the egg, and it has lysosome just like we do, but not the apes. In fact, even in the nematode, the flatworm, you see exactly the same complex enzyme, thousands of perfectly oriented and shaped, folded structures to produce a very complex chemical. In terms of blood antigen A, the closest relative is the butterbean. And then hold on to your seat here. Brain hormone. Who would have the closest brain hormone in the animal kingdom? Well, here comes the cockroach again. Believe it or not, here from Discover magazine, don't squash that roach, he may be your cousin. Man and cockroach, it seems, share a common, not similar, a common brain hormone. So what we're looking at when we look at the similarities is not that branching pattern that leads to the ape, but when you look at all of the information, rather than just what they select and line up, you see a mosaic pattern which would indicate a designer, using the blue tile here, or the tooth here and the tooth there, but not in a connected pattern. I think it fits exactly what we would predict. When we look at transitional forms, which would be normally what you would expect once you get past the beginning, going from one form to another form, you'd expect things in between, and that's the way you would see evolution. How many transitional forms do we find? Darwin looked for them, couldn't find them. Innumerable transitional forms must have existed. He had great faith. But why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? This is from Origin of the Species. Why is not every geological formation, every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. This is perhaps the greatest objection that can be urged against my theory. Many will think Darwin was convinced because of the fossil record. No, this was his biggest problem. He expected to find the transitional forms, did not find them. Ought to be there, they're not there. Why? Well, his answer was that in future years, we don't have it now, but I believe that gap will be, or these gaps will be filled in. Well, as that prediction, and this is one of the ways to test the model, proved true. Niles Eldridge is curator of the American Museum of Natural History, the second largest fossil museum in the United States. Over 32 million fossil specimens collected and cataloged. Now, if anybody would know, he would. He says Darwin, prophesied that future generations of paleontologists would fill in these gaps by diligent search. It has become abundantly clear the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's prediction. Now, he's not a creationist. He is a devout evolutionist, one of the leaders. And he knows as much or more than anybody in the country. And he says Darwin predicted and he fell flat on his face. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record, which some have tried to claim. That's not a good answer. The fossil record simply shows that this prediction was wrong from the leading authority in fossils in the country. It must be significant. Derek Ager, who was, at the time this was written, perhaps the leading authority in England, president of the British Geological Association, says it must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student, look, we see transitional forms here, have now been debunked. And then he goes through a list of several. In the immediate context here, he's talking about the horses. Anybody seen this chart where the horses are supposed to have led to the big horses? One of the things they leave out that pretty well messes up the chart is the excavation that we participated in out at Lubbock, Texas. What we looked at earlier, the Ascentius gigantus, 9 feet tall at the shoulder with the donkey. That'd mess up the chart, so they leave him out. But you're looking at big horses and little horses, which you see alive today. And we see that kind of variation also contemporaneously in the fossil record. For example, at the Ashfall Fossil Beds State Historical Park in northeastern Nebraska, we have an ashfall from a volcanic explosion that buried a lot of the animals that were living together at that time. A lot of them were horses. As Wikipedia describes this, it captures a moment in time, ecological snapshot in the range of well-preserved fossil organisms. But what it preserves is 5 different kinds of horses. From the bottom of that chart to the top of the chart, the top 2 are one-toed, like we have today. The bottom 3 are 3-toed. And they said, well, see, that's evolution. But they all were living together side by side and buried at the same time in the same spot. That's not evolution. Some of them have died out. That's devolving. George Gaylord Simpson of Harvard is the one who came up with this idea, this chart that you see that has so famously convinced a lot of people. He's arguably the leading authority in horse evolution, but he acknowledges in his book on the subject the uniform continuous transformation of Hydrocatherium into Equus, the little horse at the bottom of the chart, to Equus, the modern horse at the top. That transition, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Now, he believes in the evolution of the horse, but what you see in the textbooks did not happen. And he's got a bushy theory that really doesn't look like evolution, but it's not what you see in the textbooks. We hear a lot about Archaeopteryx, which is supposed to be one of these transitional forms. Perfect transitional form, we're told, from reptile to bird, because he's half bird and half reptile. And see, he's got teeth like reptiles, and he's got feathers like birds, and he's just halfway in between. And that was a pretty powerful argument that Darwin made. We found a number more specimens. But yes, they have teeth. Of course, some of the excellent fossils of terns. One of the most effective flyers, migrating over 3,000 miles every year. That's quite a flyer. In the fossil record had teeth. Most of them today don't. Some of them do. But is that evolution? Maybe some of you have lost your teeth. I suspect you don't think that's an upward process. And when we look in the fossil record, we see that some amphibians have teeth and some don't. And some reptiles have teeth and some don't. And some mammals have teeth and some don't. Some of you have teeth and some don't. And I don't know what that has to do with proof of evolution, the fact that some lost their teeth that did have them in the past. They had excellent feathers, that is Archaeopteryx, and you have claws out on the ends of the wings, at least and all of these are juvenile forms. In the juvenile form of the Hoatzin down in South America, you see exactly the same form, and these are perfectly modern, good birds. The juvenile forms that help them get around and out of the nest have those claws just like Archaeopteryx did. But the real knockout punch of Archaeopteryx, in terms of it being a transitional form leading to the birds, has been in the fact that we found modern birds before Archaeopteryx got there, according to their evolutionary time scale. Here from Nature, fossil bird shakes evolutionary hypothesis. Fossil remains claimed to be of two crow-sized birds 175 million years older than Archaeopteryx. It's half again as old as this bird that's supposed to have led to birds. And it's a bird. Paleontologist, Texas Tech University, and we have worked with him in the field there, in that area. He found the fossils, said they have advanced avian bird features. Now, you can't have the kids older than the parents. If you've got the results older than what's supposed to have led to it, you have a refutation. And that's what you have. Half again older than birds, you've got, that is, than Archaeopteryx, you've got modern birds. S.M. Stanley just backed off and acknowledged the fact that he can't find any transitional forms. Darwin couldn't either. And predicted they'd find them, but they haven't. And a lot of evolutionary stories in the textbooks, but they've been debunked one by one, so that Stanley says the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transitional form from one species to another. Now, Darwin said there ought to have been millions, and there should have been if evolutionary theory is true. He can't find one. Stephen Gould has, at his time, was the most famous evolutionist in the world, there from Harvard. He had over 300 articles in natural history, published numbers of books. Just before he passed away in 2002, he published his monumental tome, this book, which is the ultimate in the picture of evolutionary theory. But he makes acknowledgments, and of course he knows as much, perhaps the most knowledgeable paleontologist in the country, or was at the time. He says stasis is the major rule. Now, stasis is the opposite of change. Stays the same, status quo. Looking at Wikipedia's definition of the term, little or no evolutionary change in a species, and you're looking at it in terms of biology, that's what stasis is. He says in his tome, stasis existed in overwhelming abundance, as every paleontologist always knew. Again, the antagonistic witness here. It is the most common pattern in the fossil record, not change, but stasis. It is the primary signal of the fossil record. Darwin's expectations defined evolution as gradual change. In this context, stasis can only record sorrow and disappointment. Now again, those are not my terms. This is perhaps the leading evolutionist in the country at the time. He fell flat on his face as far as his predictions were concerned, Darwin's expectations. He continues to say it's an empirical signal of quite stunning contrariness, of empirical falsification. Now, this is what science is about, and it falsifies. It is contrary to. It is not what is predicted. Their predictions fall flat. Probably the heir to the throne of the leading paleontologist in the country today would be Donald Prothero. He's written over 5 geology textbooks, and certainly they dominate geology schools today. Virtually all of them use his books. He says, writing in 2015, many paleontologists came forward and pointed out that the geological literature was one vast monument to stasis, and that's, of course, what Gould has said, with relatively few cases where anyone had observed gradual evolution. It's a monument to not change. As Gould put it, and he quotes Gould, it was the dirty little secret hidden in the paleontological closet. Paleontologists all over the world saw it was the general pattern, and gradualism was rare, and still is the consensus 40 years later. So it hasn't changed. That's what Gould was brave enough to say, and here's the leading authority today. That's the way you describe the fossil record, not change, the opposite of evolution. So when we evaluate the two models, one is got this big monument to stasis weighing down the scales. The most common pattern, the primary signal, still the consensus. And on the other hand, you've got the transitional forms, and there may be a few, some would claim, some would acknowledge not one. Now, when you weigh those two factors, just be honest, which is the better model? If you're going to be a good scientist and follow the facts, which way do you go? But they still believe, in spite of that evidence. A.C. Stewart would be typical from Cambridge, talking about botany, his field, but it applies to all of them. The theoretically primitive type eludes our grasp. Our faith postulates its existence, but the type fails to materialize. And they are men of great faith. As someone said, the faith of the evolutionist involves the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. And that's a blind faith, not like the faith we read about in Scripture. The evidence without which it's an outrageous hypothesis was Darwin's biggest problem then, according to him. And it's worse now. The stories that have been told have been debunked. It embarrasses the evolutionist. It's a headache. It brings sorrow and disappointment, according to Gould. Empirical falsification. And what you've got to support it is blind faith. On the other hand, for the creationist, it delights the creationist, even according to Richard Dawkins. It's an explosion right at the beginning, just planted like a magic box. It's a monument to stasis, not evolution. Now, which one fits the facts? According to the facts described by the evolutionists themselves. I think that's obvious, and that they're without evidence of the fossils. It is an outrageous hypothesis, and that's not because of what I read in Genesis. That certainly carries weight. But we're talking this evening about the scientific evidence, and it's overwhelming. It's in favor, positive evidence of creation. Let's move to the second stanza of this same song regarding the fossil record and talking about fossil men. And when I talk to people about why they believe evolution, I think perhaps as often as any, they cite the evidence for fossil men as evidence for believing in evolution. That's certainly touted loudly and often by the evolutionist. But let's begin with a statement by Roger Lewin, who's the friend of Richard Dawkins we quoted earlier, editor of Research News. in his book, Bones of Contention, which is an excellent book, apart from his great ages that he affirms. The key issue, and he's talking about fossil men, the key issue is the ability to correctly infer a genetic relationship between two species on the basis of similarity in appearance. Now, this one is a little similar, or this one is not quite so similar, and you line them up based on the similarities. That's the basis. He says this is deceptive, partly because similarity of structure does not imply identical genetic heritage. A shark, which is a fish, porpoise, which is a mammal, look similar, as we have pointed out. This is where I got the idea from one of the leading evolutionists in the country. Similarity is deceptive, but that's the basis, that's the ball game as you try to make a lineup of fossil men. Richard Lewontin of Harvard, again a very famous and leading evolutionist, was caught in a weak moment when he made this statement in an interview in Harper's. And I don't want to misrepresent him. To make it fair, let's really emphasize this word know. We don't know anything about the ancestors of the human species. Now, he thinks he does, but he's, in terms of absolute knowledge, though, no, you can't know who's kin to who by just looking at the bones. All the fossils we dug up and are claimed to be ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they're ancestors. Well, yeah, he does. But as far as knowing, no, you can't know. It's up to you to draw the lines based on similarities, because there are no lines. Well, there are lots of lines that are drawn in the textbook, usually looking something like this, though not necessarily representative of what most anthropologists believe, but typical in the textbooks. Australopithecus leads to Homo erectus, to Neanderthal, and to modern. Well, let's look at that quickly. South African ape man was discovered by Donald Johanson. This is the most famous Australopithecine. And I think one of the best ways to get an idea of what's going on here is to allow David Minton to describe this. He is an authoritative anatomist who is a creationist, different from the others that we have quoted. He's an authoritative anatomist, and if you look in any medical dictionary, you'll see a number of articles by him. 30 years at Washington University School of Medicine.
So you get the picture. The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Latoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it. You'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer?
Very modern.
Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect. You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So,
Interestingly, since that time, 12 Australopithecus fossils have been found in the same general area, and all of them needed hip surgery. An interesting event occurred recently with macaque monkeys over in Israel, and the workers at the zoo who were trying to care for these monkeys noticed that they got the flu, and it did kill some of them. Some of them recovered. And the zoo says they started walking upright exclusively after they were recovered. The veterinarian says she's not sure why this macaque monkey has altered her behavior, speculating the illness could have caused brain damage. So maybe that's why we walk upright, because we got brain. Does uprightness prove what? We look at some apes that do walk sort of upright. We see other animals that do as well. We see some chickens that do some pretty fancy dancing upright. Anteaters can walk upright. Some lizards very much upright. Some of them upright enough to run across the water, and some of them upright enough to sell insurance. I don't think that proves that they're kin or belong in the lineage that leads to man. Australopithecus walked like an ape, a knuckle walker, knuckle dragging critter, and had a brain the size of an ape, much smaller than ours, had teeth like the Galata baboon, face like an ape, protruding, arms like an ape, much longer than the corresponding parts of the legs, hands like an ape that wrapped around the branches, legs, short legs like an ape, feet like an ape, and toes like an ape that wrapped around branches. What do you think that was? It must have been a duck. I think this is a good ape without the hip surgery. It would be obvious. Homo erectus is the next in the line, and historically this is where the story starts. Wish we had more time, but we'll run briefly through this. Java man, first thought to be 500,000 years old, now redated to 27, which gets them out of the evolutionary picture, a form of Homo sapien, we're told. Turkana boy, we looked at that the other night, compared with the 9-year-old 4'6" average, but he was 5'6". Large, unnoticed in a crowd, was the way Leakey described him. The 1470 skull that was dated 41 times, like a modern human, is what Mary Leakey says. The Laetoli footprints, she said, were people not unlike ourselves, but all the way back to the time period, 3.5 billion years, that they assigned to Australopithecus. But he looks, they're so perfectly human, they do fudge and put them up with Homo erectus, but they were people not unlike ourselves. The Canopy man, 4.4, way before Australopithecus, but here with Homo erectus, that is described as indistinguishable from modern. Now, if you look at the handout, you have all of these references and the documentation there. I think we have obviously humans here that are like the ugly stepsister trying to shove their foot in a shoe that doesn't fit. We get to Neanderthal, and if you've seen restorations of him, boy, that's a scary brute. And that's not very human looking. Notice the statement, again from Washington University here, Trinicus, probably the leading authority in the world on Neanderthal. He says Trinicus was considered, this is the website of Washington University, maybe somewhat prejudiced, but I think speaking accurately, he's considered to many to be the world's most influential scholar of Neanderthal biology and evolution. But he's writing in Live Science, 2008, that he has not seen evidence of any kind of difference, either biological or social, between humans and Neanderthals. Well, that critter that you looked at is very different, but that's a ridiculous restoration. Howells of Harvard said it was ridiculous, that he got the ankle bones on backwards. By all laws of physics, he should have fallen on his face, and ridiculed that. A more recent estimate here from 2019, this year, was fully upright, a balanced posture, one of the hallmarks of humanity, that is uprightness. The skeletal remains provide direct anatomical evidence that Neanderthals possessed the usual human back and neck curvature. This looked like a human, and that's the most up-to-date rendition from the leading authority in the world. Therefore, time to move beyond making Neanderthals less than human, Trinicus says. In fact, recently in Scientific American, they showed that our DNA overlaps with what they have found in the bones, which is a pretty accurate picture of their DNA, so obviously somewhat deteriorated. But their estimate is that it overlaps and that many have somewhere between 35 to 70% Neanderthal genes in their DNA. We can look out here in the audience, 70%, 35%. Yeah, I can see. These are people. Now, we look at variations today, and we see some, well, he's not too bright. Well, he's a very bright individual. He was a wrestler on the Russian team. But you compare the skull structure to the Neanderthal, and it fits just perfectly. But we've learned fairly recently that it wasn't nearly as brutish as we imagined. And here from ABC News, the image of Neanderthals may need a makeover. Scientists say at least some of these extinct hominids could have had fair skin and red hair. Have you seen them restored that way with the fair skin? Maybe something like this. The bone structure fits. Julianne Moore may not appreciate that, but it does fit. Now, National Geographic did kind of the same thing, but of course they didn't comb her hair or put makeup on, and they had her looking like this. But Neanderthal used makeup. Notice from the BBC, this is the first secure evidence for their use of cosmetics. The smoking gun that kills the argument once and for all. Bury this view of Neanderthals as half-wits. And so it's a very different picture from what we're often told. Richard Leakey has said that this is unquestionably Homo sapien, that's us. The ridiculous reconstruction they make fun of today, modern in Palestine, up on Mount Carmel, modern, we're European style, we are, quote, modern, right? We get to be modern. That was found lower with the Neanderthal on top, higher in the strata there at Mount Carmel. They used perfectly human language, according to a number of authorities that you'll see quoted in the handout. Their brain was significantly larger, about 1,400 cc's on the average, ours about 1,260, average pea brain. You're not as big a brained as the Neanderthal. Same proteins, as they compare the proteins and can sequence them, they're identical, and overlapping DNA, as we have shown. They were religious. They buried their dead with religious ceremony and with flowers. They were musical. They had flutes that were carved with exactly the same do-re-mi scale that we have today, which puts them ahead of me and some others, sort of challenged musically. They used cosmetics, had fair skin, red hair. They did sail across oceans, and they used aspirin and penicillin. That sound like apes to you? I don't think so. I think we're looking at humans that are proposed as links because they've got to find one somewhere. They believe in it, and so they're looking, and they're shoving some into a shoe that doesn't fit. That's the picture when you draw the line and look at all the evidence. You got apes and you got humans. Isn't that a surprise? We could summarize it this way. You go to the ape barn at the zoo, and you see a wide variety of apes. In the past, there were more. We've gone downhill. We have fewer examples. They've become extinct. Well, you know that man's ancestors back there somewhere, so you grab one of these that had gone extinct and you shove him into the shoe. And that's what's been going on. With humans, likewise, you see a wide variety, and sometimes our prejudice gets in the way. The fella up there in the upper left-hand corner, does he look primitive to you? That's Dr. Goolagong. He has a doctorate from Oxford. IQ of about 170. The rest of us just sort of tag along. You might think some of them look weird, but that's our prejudice. What we have, both in the fossil record and the living world, are apes and humans. But they have desperately tried to put in between what Gish has said. You take a little incus opus, a little hocus pocus, and you come up with Pithecus spoofus. It's not what you see in the fossil record. When you look at the fossil record of apes and men, it's obvious that they are distinct, and as in the case with the horses or with the birds or with the reptiles, you see obvious evidence that the fossil record favors creation. Sudden, complex, diverse beginning, diverse all the way through, testifying in that area that is the evidence, without which it's an outrageous hypothesis that it's very much in favor of creation. Positive evidence. All right, we'll conclude at this point. I think I went 6 minutes over 30 minutes plus 36 minutes. We got both of them in. Thank you for your patience. Let's see if some of you have some questions. Everybody understood all of that? Yes. Questions? Somebody in the back? Yes. Do we have I'm having a hard time hearing, I'm sorry.
Did they ever figure out, or are they still trying to figure it out, that monkeys and humans were once related, as I've been told?
I think they were created all on day 6, related in that they had the same creator, but there is not an iota of evidence that they evolved one from the other. That's just wishful thinking of people that want to get away from the idea of a creator. Very, very different. Their fingers, their toes, their cholesterol, their teeth are all very different.
Hi, Doctor.
Yes.
When these antagonistic witnesses were writing these excerpts that you had that were basically revealing that there are problems with their theory, who were they speaking to? How did they think that was going to be received? And if it was put back in context, did they gloss it back over and wrap it up at the conclusion of the articles? Or?
Well, to really answer that question, you need to go look, and that's why we have the handouts with the documentation and the references, so you can go to the library and see exactly in context what they said, which we obviously don't have time to present with all of the quotes. I'm as conscientious as I can be not to misrepresent them, and I think that will be obvious when you go through and check the context. There are ways, like, as I illustrated, you start with this quote and don't stop there, you might get a different impression. Let's go ahead and be fair, and I think we've done that. Now, why would they admit this? Of course, motives judging is something we can't always, we can't do individually. That's forbidden. But we can see that they're faced with the facts. One phenomenon that I have observed when I'm confronting some of these professors is that they will admit these things, especially in their field, and then say, but the real evidence is over here in this fellow's field. And then you go over and talk to him, and he says, no, it's really over here. And I had the experience of trying to arrange a debate at Vanderbilt University for Dwayne Gish. And I went round and round and round and round. It was from the biologist to the microbiologist to the geologist to the paleontologist, and every one of them said the evidence is in the other fellow's field, and nobody would debate. They all knew in their field it wasn't there, or at least that was my conclusion. So that would be part of it. They see this is their area of expertise, and yep, that's the way, but somebody else has got the answer. Now, that's not going to apply in all instances, but that may help understand. Yeah.
Brother Patton, so when we're talking about the lack of transitional forms or transitory forms between different species, what's the current explanation for that? What would men like Richard Dawkins or other authorities in that field, how would they describe the lack of those critical missing links?
Well, the latest is aliens, which I'd just say, good. Yeah, you go ahead and say that. I sit back and grin, and I think the kids are not going to buy it. Some will, but you see a variety with different individuals. There's some, one of the professors down at Beaumont at Lamar University at Beaumont, said, here is this book, and he's got a list of all of the fossils that have been, it was a big, thick book, and it probably hundreds of thousands of fossils that were cataloged. And he says, every one of these are transitional forms, because each one led to the other, and it all came from a common ancestor, and he has faith. He believes in evolution, and therefore all of them are transitional. But trying to show that one went from another to another he didn't have to do that. He just has faith. So that would be the response of some. But it's going to be varied.
I have a question about the fossil men that you were showing us and the differences between like the Homo erectus and the Neanderthal. Do they call them different things just because of what their fossils look like, or are there some genetic differences why they call them different things?
Well, we look around the room. We see differences. You look at the skull, the Oriental skull, and you don't see the brow ridges. You see the high brow generally. You look at the Australian Aboriginal, you see very heavy brows in contrast. And yes, you can see variations. The American Indian compared to the American Eskimo, you can, but they're good people, and trying to say that, and we see prejudice very obvious when they say, well, all right, here's dark skin and here's light skin, and that's different. Yeah, well, you've got blue eyes and you've got brown eyes, and that's different, but you're just not prejudiced about that part. We see a variety. Blue eyes, brown eyes. What does that mean? It means God gave variety. Look at the birds. The variety is awesome. We see some of that in the world today. Many women here not as beautiful as my wife, and I'm glad that we've got variation here. Makes things interesting. But it doesn't say anything about evolution. Other questions?
So as we learn more and the theories are debunked and the scientists agree that they're debunked, what's next? What do you propose, or what do you feel, or what do you conjecture is next for science education?
The authorities will acknowledge that they're debunked. You still got them in the textbooks. Why? Well, you don't have anything else to replace it with in a lot of instances. But debunking it doesn't get it out of the textbooks. They don't play fair. And many times they will acknowledge, well, yeah, that's probably not good evidence, but it's still there and they're still teaching it. So it hasn't gone away. The book Icons of Evolution documents about 12 of the main arguments that have been made that are true icons, like the pepper moths, the finches, and so forth. And documents, as we showed, it's totally debunked, but they're still in the textbooks. So what's next? Well, they've got to find something else. Now, if we were to completely debunk, and I think when you see more and more evidence accumulating, you wonder, surely this alien story is not going to help. We ought not to assume that the Christians win by default just because evolution is defeated. The spirit of lawlessness that doesn't want to submit to a creator is going to find something else. In Old Testament, even the stump they carved out and bowed down in front of. This is preferable to submitting to the creator. It's pretty bizarre, but yeah, it's real. And so we've got some of this New Age bizarre ideas that are considered alternative to a God that created. So it's our job not only to show that this is not in harmony with the evidence, but to show what is substantiated. We got to fight negatively and positively. Other questions? Let me ask one myself. I ask good questions. Often, especially after this lecture, we have people that say, where did the races come from? And what we've been able to see is that the changes come very dramatically, especially with geographic distribution. But we've learned that the epigenome is a new order of complexity above the genome, above the DNA, that is like an orchestra conductor that turns this on and turns that off. And that under different environmental conditions, and environmental conditions do produce inheritable changes. The conductor says, we need darker skin here. We need lighter skin. We need brow ridges so that now you can see in the bright sun across the savannah. And then when you take out of that environment, it goes back. The cave fish that lost their eyes, you take them out of the cave, about 4 or 5 generations later, that fish is going to have eyes again. that same strain. The genetic information is still there. It's just turned off and turned back on. And we see that kind of thing happening, and that's sometimes called racism. But I think we need to understand where the ideas of racism came from. Do you know what the title of Darwin's book was? Anybody here know? This is what we know, Origin of the Species by Natural Selection, but that wasn't the whole title. And Preservation of Favored Races was the title of his book. And he was a rabid racist. Quoting here from Darwin in a letter to Graham, looking to the world at a not so distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. And Gould comments on that. Gould was not a racist, but he acknowledges that the early part of the 19th century was characterized by racism that came from Darwin. He says biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. The pervasive racism of white scientists it is described in detail here. They looked to the activities of their own children for comparison with normal adult behaviors in lower races. And he's referring to Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was president, or head of the American Museum of Natural History, that made a statement like that and had a book looking like this, and I'm ashamed to show it. That just makes your skin crawl. The idea that this gradual up from the apes led through the races to finally the white supreme. This was from Haeckel, one of Darwin's bulldogs. You ought to be ready to throw up looking at that. The latest research from the human genome reported here, San Diego Union Tribune, no trace of race. The Genome Project proves nothing biological separates people. They point out that you do this percentage of difference as best you can of the DNA, and you find a greater difference between a brother and sister with dark skin than you do between what we'd call the white and black. I don't like to use those terms. I think they're all brethren in Adam. Scientific American had an article documenting all of this. Does race exist? Their answer, no. Well, you got dark skin, but you go over to India and you got those that are Caucasian. I mean, very obviously Caucasian, that's defined, but their skin's darker than most of those called black over here. You go to Ireland, you see red hair and blue eyes. You see a variety, and some of those suites of changes collect, but what does that mean? That means God likes variety. I think the anchor for us would be passages like Genesis 3. Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Doesn't that make us all brothers and sisters? And sometimes I hear some of my folk with brethren with darker skin, they'll talk about the brothers. I want to know why they're leaving me out. I think we all belong together. Similar statement made in Acts 17. He made from one man every nation. Now, one blood in the King James, but that word's not there. From one man, every nation. So you got one father and you got one mother. That means we're all brothers and sisters. Now, if you're a good creationist, I think that's what you believe. If you're a good evolutionist, you probably don't believe that. And I think I know where the difference comes from. And I think we need to lay those differences at the feet of the evolutionist. Okay, anybody else got a question? We thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this week. Always glad to meet my brothers and sisters across the country. And I appreciate the hospitality, the graciousness, to be in your homes and get to know you. And we hope this has been faith strengthening. I hope it gives you some ammunition to fight, I think, a very important battle. And if you get down to Arkansas, we've got a museum that you need to come look at and see some really exciting things. But thank you very much for your patience and for the opportunity to be with you.